Hey everyone, going through part 2 of our Tech Corner series this week. So going through high bar and low bar squats. So I want to cover a few main points around just generally looking at squatting, and then we'll cover a couple points specific to the low bar squat as well. So 5 key points we'll try to outline today. So when, as a coach myself or many other coaches as well, when we're looking at a squat, first place we want to start is just making sure you've got good unloaded movement. So making sure that you're able to squat without any external input, that you can have good form, you've got appropriate mobility to make sure you're going through the movement properly. That means when you load it up, you're loading a functional pattern where everything is working properly, and you're not just sandwiching on weight to compensate for a lack of control somewhere else. You're able to control your own body. So making sure that whatever squat form you use, whether it be a wide stance low bar equipped squat, or maybe something a little bit more moderate where people fall into like an average looking squat where they've got a relatively shoulder width stance, somewhat toed out, slight forward lean, where you can end up with something like that, for example, and just able to replicate that with the bar, where your joint angles look pretty well the same, right? That barbell shouldn't impact your movement too much. It should really just change the amount of resistance you have, at least in a high bar front squat. Low bar is a little different, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So making sure you've got good unloaded movement will be our first place we start. Second piece we want to look at is just making sure you've got proper ankle mobility. So as much as I kind of poop on mobility work and having people do a bunch of static stretching, I find most people's restrictions are more positional, where you can't get to the bottom of a squat because you're starting here, so you run out of hip range of motion, for example. We want to make sure that the ankles are moving properly for your squat form. It's just one of those joints that tends to get a little bit sticky and can look like it's an error in hip mobility or not bracing properly when there is actually a limitation in the ankle. So assuming that your body position is correct and you're bracing well, and you've got adequate hip mobility, and you can sit in a chair effectively, we want to just take a quick look at ankle mobility. So using easy tests like having your foot about a palm width away from the wall and just driving your knee forward and coming back without losing that heel contact is a pretty easy way to clear yourself for squatting. Not a super complicated test, but it's something worth checking out if you are having trouble getting to the bottom of a squat or you're having trouble with the stability. Sometimes you can find that one ankle is a little stiffer than the other. That could contribute to, or maybe causing or contributing to a shift you might get in a squat or something like that. So the next piece we want to look at, point number 3, is taking a gander at the ability to create pressure in the abs, and then also more importantly, maintaining it throughout the squat, the movement as well as in between reps, because realistically, you're probably not training just singles. You're probably going to train a lot of sets of 3 to 5 in your training, maybe some sets of 8 to 10 if you're in a volume block, or 12, who knows. But the idea with it is you should be creating full 360-degree expansion. We've outlined this in a lot of other videos, where you've got just as much pressure in your obliques as your back as your front, right? So keeping that brace is really, really important. If you struggle to find that brace, you want to implement it into your squat, there's a couple ways you can do that. So first is just being able to brace laying on your back. So something like a 3-month position, for example, and just laying here and practicing feeling that stiffness you can create and your ability to breathe into it to create that abdominal pressure, that pop can effect. If you can do that, but you're having trouble actually integrating it into your squat, something like a 360 belt is an awesome place to start. You don't necessarily have to use these. We're not endorsed or anything by them, but I've just found it to be a really effective product. You could just as easily use a hip circle around your waist, or you could even have a belt and just have it a notch or two too loose so you can get that same touch sensation. So what I like about the 360 belt though is it's got these little ping pong balls or whatever they are in here, and it just acts sort of like how you would push against your abs to make sure you're bracing properly, making sure you're creating enough pressure and stiffness. So if I was trying to focus on really bracing through my obliques and my anterior aspect to my obliques as well, I would just position the contact points here to where they would be touching my obliques and the anterior aspect of my obliques. And then as I squat, I can push out against them and I can feel that pressure against my abs. So then as I go through my squat, I just have more awareness around what's going on. There's a little bit of stretch in the fabric too, which is nice because it gives you a bit of feedback. You'll feel it stretch out and there's more resistance as you create better abdominal pressure. So something like that to create a touch contact to integrate into your squat is a really great technique building tool, as well as just good for building general awareness around what's going on in your squat. You might have one oblique that's firing later than another, that's leading to a hip shift. You could be extending too much or flexing too much. It's good for building awareness. One other note with ankle mobility is, while I think it's really important to have enough ankle mobility, lifting shoes like these are super effective at working around an ankle limitation. So if you do have a squat where you are really strong, quite knees forward, but you're limited by your ankle mobility, these are good places to start. The second piece to work on would be actually correcting that ankle mobility restriction. And a personal favorite of mine is getting into loaded eccentric. So I find these tend to stick really well as opposed to just static stretching where you're just kind of mashing your calves or whatnot. Getting into a loaded single leg calf raise like so. So my goal is I'm keeping my big toe on an elevated surface. You could use a bumper plate, a couple stacked up 45s. You could do them off the edge of a stair, doesn't matter. But you're trying to go down to about a 10 count. And what that does is it allows you to stretch through the muscle, and then creating that contraction after actually helps ingrain that mobility a little bit more, which allows you to, again, go a little deeper. So they could look something like this, where you're going down 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then I'll hang out in that stretch for a moment and then push back up. And then I could work on going a little deeper again. 7, 8, 9, 10, and see I'm running out of room there. If I can do this, I'm probably okay for squatting. But if you have a restriction, you're probably not getting to the ground and then coming back up. So make sure you feel that stretch in your calf or your ankle, and then press back up out of it. Some sets of 5 or 10 here are a really good way to prep the ankles for squats if you're limited in the ankles. Okay, moving on, getting into some more specific squat stuff. Going back to our third point about maintaining abdominal pressure properly as you go through the squat. If you have a particular range of motion that you struggle with adding in some isometrics, so holding one position in the squat and learning to maintain pressure there is a really good teaching tool. So for example, using something like a reverse pin squat would be a really good place to start with this. So let's say as I go through my squat, I'm really great on my descent and then I'm good, but as I get just about to lock out where I would normally lock my knees and lock my hips out, I bring my knees up and then I'm pausing here and I hold that for about 20 or 30 seconds. So the idea with this is just trying to find that weak point, go a little bit before that weak point, and then create resistance there so that you have to be braced because you can't create enough force otherwise. So in a high bar squat, for example here, I might be up, and let's say my squat ended up being here, and right about there is where I'd start to lose my brace, and then I'd struggle on subsequent reps to create good pressure. I could set my pins to about that height where I'd walk the bar under, create a brace, and then push up against the pins as hard as I could. And then you back it out and walk it back in. Some sets of 20 to 30 seconds here are plenty effective. If you're really focusing on your bracing, you'll find these are an awesome tool. They give you a lot of carryover into your main lifts. Using these either as a programmed accessory or having them as just a warm-up for your movements in the same way that you do some sets of 10 with a plate before working up to 2 plates on a squat. These are a great place to start at just building that right pattern in your movements and just getting a proper position and keeping a consistent brace throughout. So that covers it for our general squat principles. Getting into more specific low bar squat principles, there's 2 main areas that we want to look at. So first one is shoulder and thoracic spine mobility. So the high bar squat, not really that extreme of upper body and shoulder position. The bar is resting on your traps, your arms are holding onto the bar, but largely the bar is just kind of letting gravity, or you're letting gravity do its work on the bar, sits it on your traps, and then you squat. Low bar squatting, on the other hand, is a bit more of an extreme shoulder and upper back position. It lends itself to a much tighter upper back. You need to have more mobility in the shoulders because of that lower bar position. And then on top of that, you just need to make sure that you are actually creating active tension in the position as opposed to just passively letting the bar sit on you, which can tend to pull you forward. So ideally, your low bar squat should end up looking something like this. hand position and all that can vary, but roughly speaking, that bar is going to sit on your rear delts. And you'll see my spine stays pretty neutral there, right? I'm not hunched over or anything like that. If you don't have the mobility to do a low bar squat in the hand position that you're in, you're going to get one of two things. Either, first of all, is you're going to find you get too extended because you don't have the external rotation in your shoulders where you get stuck here. So the only way you get to the bar is throwing yourself back, at which point, of course, that's a bit of a wonky looking low bar squat. The second, and this is probably a little bit more common that I'll see, is people aren't bracing properly. And so they'll try to brace by locking down instead of pushing out. And this is very common with those lifters. You'll see where they'll take a breath and do that. And they'll breathe in, lift their ribs, and then hunker down. Not a lot of abdominal pressure there. That's more of an outside in brace as opposed to inside out where you're creating pressure. What that does is it pulls the head forward, pulls the neck forward, anteriorly tilts the shoulder blades, puts a lot of stress on the elbows. On top of that, it just puts you into a very strange bracing position where you're not able to really create a ton of stability in the trunk, and as a result, you're just losing pounds on your squat. So you can see the difference in that squat position on if I'm in my low bar squat and I lock down and I'm there and I get pitched quite far forward compared to creating a brace, actively locking my upper back in. And that's a much stronger position. I don't feel, even just from a confidence standpoint, I don't feel like I'm getting buried by the bar. Last piece we want to go through with your low bar squat is just understanding that there's going to be some differences between a low bar squat and, say, a high bar squat or a front squat. So because that bar is placed lower on the torso, that lever arm from the bar to the hips is shorter. Gives you a big mechanical advantage at the hips as you're going through the movement. Really common in powerlifting for that reason. So because of that, though, your center of mass actually shifts, and you need to either, if your bar is sitting in a high bar position, you need to either, from that high bar, lean forward more to keep the bar over your shoulders, because you see here at the bottom, the bar is in one position, but it almost rolls backwards, and it puts me onto my heels. So I need to lean forward more, or I need to push my knees further forward in order to stay balanced in the squat. So that's really the main thing that we try to look for in the low bar squat, is just making sure that your torso angles, particularly the forward lean, is working towards your low bar squat as opposed to working against yourself. So high bar squat pretty close to how you're going to squat body weight. Low bar squat, take that same squat, add a little bit more forward lean to compensate for that changed bar position, and then you're good to go. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below or shoot me an email or a private message. And if you have any questions or things that you want to see in future videos, do the same. Thanks very much, and I'll see you all next week. Have a great one. Bye.